Integrating a private endpoint with DNS is crucial to ensure seamless connectivity to Azure resources using their private IP addresses rather than relying on public endpoints. When you set up a private endpoint, Azure assigns a private IP address from your virtual network to the Azure service and makes it accessible only within the private network. However, to connect to this service by its name, DNS configuration need to direct the request to the private IP rather than the public IP. Here is how to integrate a private endpoint with DNS. First, understand private DNS zones. Azure uses private DNS zones to resolve the names of Azure service to private IP addresses within the virtual network. For example, if you have a private endpoint for an Azure storage account, the DNS zone such as private.link.blob.core.windows.net can resolve the storage account's name to the private IP assigned to the endpoint rather than the public IP. Note, for each supported service, it has its own private DNS zone. To set up DNS integration for private endpoints, create a private DNS zone in Azure for the service you want to connect to privately. For example, for Azure storage, you create a DNS zone named privatelink.blob.core.windows.net and add a record in the private DNS zone that maps the resourcefully qualified domain name to the private IP address assigned to the private endpoint. To make the private DNS zone accessible from your virtual network, link the private DNS zone to your virtual network so resources within the virtual network can resolve the FQDN of the Azure service to the private IP address. If you need on-premises or multi-VNet resources to access the private endpoint, forward DNS queries. You can set up DNS forwarding from on-premises or other virtual network to Azure private DNS zone. You do this by forwarding DNS queries to a DNS server in Azure that is linked to the private DNS zone. Alternatively, you can use Azure's DNS resolver if you need custom forwarding rules to route DNS queries from multiple networks. If you are using custom DNS servers, you need to configure them to forward queries to Azure DNS or directly to the private DNS zone in Azure. Private endpoints are regional, so DNS configuration are specific to each region's private endpoint unless you set up forwarding to support global resources. For scenarios where Azure manages the DNS resolution, link the private DNS zone to your virtual network. For custom DNS, configure appropriate forwarding rules to direct DNS requests correctly. In short, by integrating private endpoints with DNS, you ensure that your applications and user can securely access Azure resources using private IPs while still connecting via familiar domain names.